The night when people whispered that the eternal city could finally die did not begin like any ordinary night, for in the air there was a stillness too heavy, a silence that pressed against the chest like the weight of centuries. And in that silence the marble pillars of the Forum, the statues of gods with their blind eyes staring into eternity, and the cracked streets that once carried the footsteps of emperors all seemed to lean inward, listening, as if Rome itself, weary and hollow from centuries of glory and corruption, was holding its breath, and yet no one could truly say at what moment an empire dies, whether it is in the instant a gate creaks open under the hand of a traitor, whether it is when a torch is raised and the first roof catches flame, whether it is when the cries of foreign soldiers echo in alleyways once ruled by senators, or whether the death of an empire is slower, quieter, dripping away like water through cracks no one notices until the vessel is empty. But that night the people of Rome felt something uncanny, something that chilled their blood and made them wonder if the legends of eternity had been lies, because from the Palatine Hill the emperor looked out over his city with eyes swollen from sleeplessness, clutching decrees that no longer had power, while in the taverns drunk soldiers muttered that their pay was gone, their loyalty already sold to whomever could promise gold. And in the darkened temples priests argued softly, one praying to Jupiter to raise thunder against the barbarians, another whispering prayers to Christ, another clinging to ancient household gods carved from wood, all of them unsure which divinity, if any, still listened. And in the far corners of the city mothers hushed their children who asked why the sky seemed too dark, why the wind seemed to carry sounds of hooves and steel, and merchants counted coins knowing they might be worthless tomorrow, and the slaves, the ones who had borne the empire on their backs unseen for centuries, lay awake with wide eyes, wondering if freedom would come with fire or if chains would simply change hands. And so as midnight deepened, the city itself felt like a creature awaiting the knife, for Rome had lived too long, grown too vast, carried too many secrets, and in that vastness was its doom. And though centuries later historians would argue over whether the empire fell in that one single night or dissolved across generations, those who lived within it knew that night was different, knew that something vast was breaking, and you could hear it in the smallest of sounds, a hinge crying out as a gate moved where no gate should move, the muffled clink of coins passing from hand to hand as betrayal was purchased, the sudden beating of hooves in streets where horses should not be, and above all the silence of the stars as if the heavens themselves were watching the collapse of what men had once believed eternal. And so if you walk with me now through that night you will see not only the Visigoth warriors gathered in shadows, waiting like wolves for a signal, their eyes glowing faintly with hunger for plunder and vengeance, but also the senators in their villas clutching wine cups with trembling hands, whispering that perhaps the barbarians would be merciful if greeted with gifts. You will see the legions, once the pride of Rome, reduced to scattered mercenaries, some already bribed to turn their backs, others sharpening blades half-heartedly, because they no longer fought for an idea called Rome but for survival. And you will hear in the alleys the voices of prophets and madmen crying that the empire's sins had called down punishment, while thieves slipped silently through the same darkness ready to profit from whatever chaos came, and at the edges of the city walls stood men who had once sworn never to allow Rome to be breached, their armor rusted, their hands weary, knowing the gates they guarded might already be lost, and somewhere in the hush of that midnight the first gate did open, whether by treachery, by fear, or by gold, no one would ever agree, but it opened with the quiet sigh of wood on stone, and into that sigh rode shadows that would change the world, and yet as they entered, some swore they felt the earth itself tremble, not with the march of men but with the weight of time, as if history had decided in that instant that Rome, which had called itself eternal, would be eternal only in memory, and the living would taste ashes. And so the question, did Rome fall in a single night, becomes not just a historian's debate but a ghost that lingers, because in that night's darkness everything seemed possible, that the city might survive by a miracle, that it might be devoured completely, or that it might sink into some in-between state, half alive, half dead, haunting the centuries to come. And the people who clutched each other in those streets could not know which was true, only that the air was thick with dread, that every flicker of torchlight looked like flame ready to consume the whole city, and every whisper sounded like prophecy. And still, the night deepened, carrying with it the sound of wolves at the gates, though these wolves wore armor and bore swords, and behind them stood a king whose eyes had long stared at Rome like a starving man stares at forbidden bread, and at last the bread was within reach, but as his men prepared to feast. Inside the city the last defenders whispered prayers, sharpened steel, or simply waited, frozen by the knowledge that empires, no matter how mighty, are only mortal, and perhaps mortality always strikes in the silence before dawn. Dawn did not arrive gently over the 7 hills of Rome. It came like a blade tearing through the sky, staining the horizon with a gray pallor that made the marble temples look like tombs and the once proud avenues resemble corridors of a dying labyrinth. And though the sun crept upward, its light carried no warmth, for the city awoke not to the sound of merchants calling their wares or children running across cobblestones, but to the dull thunder of footsteps, foreign and relentless, pounding through streets that had never before known such trespass. And as the people staggered from their homes, they found themselves staring not at the disciplined legions of their fathers Rome, but at shadows draped in fur, steel glinting at their belts, their eyes cold and hungry, and above them fluttered not the eagle of the empire but the ragged banners of Alaric's Visigoths. And in that moment every heart knew what the night had only whispered, that the eternal city was no longer eternal, that its gates had been opened not by gods but by human hands, hands that had traded safety for betrayal, hands that would forever be stained by the choice. And yet even as soldiers stormed through, breaking doors, seizing treasure, driving terrified citizens before them, there was in the air a strange uncertainty, for some streets lay eerily quiet, untouched as though the invaders themselves feared certain corners, and some houses bore markings on their doors as if someone within had bargained for mercy, and in the chaos there spread rumors faster than fire, that the Pope had pleaded for clemency, that certain senators had already allied with the barbarians, that gold had been promised to spare the city from complete destruction, and no one knew which whispers were true, only that the sound of Rome breaking was everywhere, the crash of statues dragged down, the shouts of men seizing women, the wails of children, the crack of fire catching wood. And yet amid this cacophony another sound rose, quieter but more haunting, the sound of prayers murmured from every corner, to Christ, to Jupiter, to forgotten spirits of hearth and earth, as if the people did not care which god answered as long as one did, but none seemed to. For the Visigoths marched unchallenged, and the emperor himself was nowhere, hidden or fled, his absence a silence louder than the screams. And so the city that had once commanded the known world now crouched like prey, and those who witnessed it said it was as if time itself split in two, for they could see in their minds the Rome of the past, armies marching, triumphal processions, the roar of the Colosseum, and yet before their eyes they saw Rome powerless, stripped, humiliated. And it was this contrast that cut deepest, the sense that something more than walls and gold was dying, that an entire age was ending, and as dawn rose higher it revealed scenes that would sear themselves into memory. A senator dragged from his villa, beaten not for his wealth but for the hatred his arrogance had stirred. A priest clutching a sacred relic, begging for sanctuary, only to be trampled by soldiers who did not even recognize the object's worth. A mother covering her child with her own body as fire devoured their home, and through it all Alaric rode, not with the fury of a conqueror but with the grim satisfaction of inevitability, his face like stone, his eyes scanning not for glory but for certainty that the city was truly his. And yet in his heart, some whispered, even he felt unease, for to strike Rome was to strike the center of the world, and what man could carry such a weight without trembling? And so as the hours dragged on the sack of Rome became both chaos and ritual, destruction and revelation, a tearing apart of the old so that something unknown might emerge, and the question burned hotter with every passing moment, Was this truly the end of Rome in a single day, a single night, a single dawn, or was this only the mask of death covering a body already long decayed? And as flames licked the sky and smoke curled over the Tiber, the answer remained hidden, tangled in the cries of the living and the silence of the gods. But one truth none could deny. An empire had been pierced, and whatever rose after would never be the same. And yet, as the dust settled over the charred stones and the echo of shattered civilization still rang faintly through the narrow alleys and grand avenues, a new, more insidious understanding began to creep into the minds of those who survived, for they realized that Rome had not merely been broken by the fury of Alaric and his warriors but by the invisible forces that had long lain beneath its surface, forces of corruption, complacency, and fractured loyalty that had hollowed the empire from within. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating fragments of frescoes scorched beyond recognition, the citizens wandering among the ruins felt the unsettling sensation that the city itself was aware of its own demise, as though each fallen column, each upturned mosaic, whispered secrets of betrayal and unheeded omens, and historians centuries later would puzzle over accounts of the night, piecing together stories that seemed to contradict one another yet converged on a singular truth, that Rome's end was not an abrupt thunderclap but a convergence of innumerable small failures, of quiet decisions, of doors left unlocked, of messages ignored, of soldiers disheartened before the battle began. And in this convergence there lingered the uncanny notion that perhaps the city had surrendered not because of force alone, but because it recognized its own fragility. And within this surrender lay the seeds of a haunting mystery, for reports tell us that certain districts were untouched, certain temples unpillaged, and some streets remained eerily silent, as if protected by invisible wards or ancient pacts long forgotten, and those who dared to traverse these ghostly thoroughfares spoke of shadows moving against the light, of figures glimpsed at the edge of vision, not human, not entirely mortal, and whispers grew of Rome being watched by unseen entities, custodians of fate who had allowed the empire to rise and fall according to laws inscrutable to men. And it was in these moments of terror and awe that the surviving scholars, scribes, and priests began to record events not merely as historical facts but as fragments of prophecy, warning, and memory, attempting to stitch together the incomprehensible sequence of choices, betrayals, and cosmic coincidences that had led to this singular dawn. A dawn that marked not only physical devastation but the spiritual unraveling of a world that had thought itself eternal. And in the villas abandoned by patricians, the frescoes depicting Roman victories now seemed grotesque parodies of triumph, mocking the living who wandered beneath the cracked plaster, while in the marketplaces, charred coins and broken pottery told stories of commerce that had vanished overnight, as if the very lifeblood of the city had drained in silence, leaving only echoes of human endeavor. And across the 7 hills, the surviving clergy gathered to pray, their voices trembling, uncertain, for even they could not comprehend why the gods had allowed the empire's heart to be pierced, and the omens they had long feared, the comets, the unnatural storms, the outbreaks of plague in distant provinces, now seemed less coincidental and more like the deliberate writing of destiny upon the world, a message in a language humans barely understood. And in the shadows of these sacred halls, some claimed to see figures of authority long vanished, phantoms of emperors and generals who seemed to observe with cold indifference the city they had failed to save, their presence both a warning and a lament. And as the Tiber's waters carried remnants of burned scrolls and relics downstream, it became clear that the empire's collapse was encoded not only in stone and blood but in memory, in the very consciousness of those who survived. For each witness carried the story differently, each recounted in fearful whispers that grew into legend. Until centuries later scholars debated endlessly whether Rome truly fell in a single night, or whether that night had been an intensification, a symbolic condensation of decay that had been unfolding for generations. And the truth, perhaps, lay somewhere in between, for the empire had been battered by external forces, Yet the ultimate collapse had been made possible only by the intricate web of human frailty, ambition, and unseen pressures that had accumulated silently beneath the veneer of power. And even now, walking the ruins in imagination or reality, one could feel the pulse of history thrum faintly, a reminder that empires, no matter how grand, are fragile constructions of collective belief, and that the fall of Rome, violent as it was, carried with it lessons far beyond the sack itself, a lesson in vigilance, in humility, in the understanding that a single night may appear decisive, but it is the countless nights that precede it, the choices uncounted, the whispers unheeded, that truly allow such a collapse to occur. And as the survivors of that fateful dawn, regrouped in the city's shadowed corners, tending wounds both seen and unseen, listening to the distant cries and the soft, eerie rustle of debris, the horizon itself seemed to ripple, as if acknowledging that the world had changed irreversibly, that Rome's old order had been supplanted by uncertainty, and in that uncertainty was the first glimmer of what would become the medieval future. A new era shaped not by legions but by feudal lords, by faith, by migration, and by the slow, relentless transformation of memory into legend. And yet even as the centuries moved on, the night of Rome's fall retained its haunting potency, a story told and retold, a narrative that condensed years of decline into the terrifying clarity of a single, unforgettable dawn, leaving behind questions that continue to ripple through history. Could a city so powerful really vanish overnight? Or was that night merely the visible culmination of an imperceptible unraveling that had been underway since the empire's height? And in pondering that, one realizes that Rome's story is as much about human perception as it is about events, about how men and women interpret chaos, fear, and inevitability, weaving them into tales that seek order in what is ultimately disorder. And as those who lived through it later passed down fragments of memory, sometimes accurate, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes infused with myth, the legend of the eternal city's collapse grew, and with it, a profound understanding that the fall of great civilizations is rarely simple, rarely confined to one night, but that our minds, desperate for narrative, often compress centuries into moments, disasters into singularities, so that the story of Rome's last dawn, with Alaric at its gates, is remembered as both instantaneous and eternal, violent and quiet, mortal and cosmic, and in walking its imagined streets, listening to its imagined cries, one senses that the empire's death was not merely an event but a continuum, a delicate interplay of human frailty, fate, and the inexorable march of time. And as the sun finally reached its zenith that day, the city stood both dead and alive in perception, its true collapse hidden beneath layers of smoke, memory, and whispered speculation, and those who survived, few and frightened, would carry forward not only the trauma of witnessing history undone but the understanding that empires, no matter how mighty, are sustained by belief, by vigilance, and by the fragile threads that, once severed, allow even the greatest to vanish, leaving only echoes, ruins, and questions that stretch endlessly into the horizon. And as the remnants of Rome's once majestic skyline faded into the morning haze, a profound stillness settled over the city, but it was a stillness heavy with the weight of unseen witnesses, for every ruined temple, every toppled statue, every shattered mosaic seemed to breathe with the memory of what had occurred, and in that breathing, there was a whisper, a trace of something older than emperors, older than legions, older even than the city itself, a consciousness woven into the very stones, that survived the flames and the pillage, and the survivors, those who had escaped the immediate fury of Alaric's Visigoths, moved like phantoms through the ashes, their faces pale, their eyes haunted not only by the horror they had seen but by the unnerving sense that the city had been complicit in its own demise, that somehow the collapse had been orchestrated from within as much as from without. And as they stumbled over fallen columns and through streets strewn with debris, it became clear that the night's terror was not over, for even in daylight, the shadows cast by ruined arches stretched unnaturally long, bending in directions that defied the sun, and the wind carried with it strange murmurs, fragments of voices speaking languages that no living Roman could identify, as though the very air had been impregnated with echoes of centuries, both past and future, and in those echoes, one could almost hear the lament of the empire itself, a slow, mournful cry that rose above the crackle of fire still burning in some forgotten quarter, a cry that seemed to accuse and console simultaneously, whispering of betrayal and warning, and scholars who would one day piece together the story from fragments of letters, half-burned manuscripts, and oral traditions would note these anomalies, struggling to understand whether they were hallucinations born of trauma, supernatural signs, or the subtle insistence of history pressing itself upon the living. And as these survivors gathered in scattered groups on the outskirts of the city, trying to reconcile what had been and what remained, they became aware of an unsettling pattern, as if certain buildings, certain avenues, had been left untouched by accident or design, and the more they explored, the more they suspected that the city itself, or the forces that governed it, had chosen to spare pockets of memory, pockets of life, in order to witness, to remember, or perhaps to pass judgment on the next generation. And among the priests who survived, there was talk not of vengeance or restitution but of rites long forgotten, of prayers to gods who had been silent, and of the terrifying idea that the silence itself had a purpose, a message encoded in absence rather than presence. And in the palaces and villas once home to Rome's elite, scholars and scribes began to uncover clues that hinted at conspiracies deeper than the sack of the city. Documents that revealed secret alliances, promises made to outsiders for protection that now seemed both pragmatic and damning, and there were rumors of artifacts removed from temples, sacred objects that were said to carry within them the essence of Roman authority, now scattered across the lands, lost to time yet potent in memory. And as the survivors moved through this devastated landscape, they encountered signs of fear and desperation, of families torn apart, of hidden hoards of wealth buried or abandoned, and of individuals whose moral compass had been twisted by the chaos into acts of both mercy and cruelty. And in this mixture of survival and collapse, one could almost see the skeleton of a new social order being etched into the streets, a nascent medieval structure emerging from the ashes of imperial Rome. For though the legions were gone, though the Senate had scattered and the emperor was nowhere to be found, the human instinct to organize, to seek safety, and to impose order persisted, and those who would come to power in the centuries ahead would do so standing on the memory of that night, guided as much by fear and superstition as by wisdom or ambition. And in that sense, the fall of Rome was never a singular event but a continuum, a long, unbroken thread that began with cracks in loyalty, cracks in morality, cracks in trust, and that culminated in the terrifying clarity of the sack, yet continued afterward in the reshaping of Europe, in the migration of peoples, in the spread of Christianity as both a unifying and divisive force, in the memory of what had been lost and what might never be restored. And even as the Tiber flowed silently past the ruins, carrying fragments of the past toward the sea, there lingered the feeling that Rome had left behind more than debris. It left behind questions, puzzles, and shadows that would haunt generations. And as each observer, whether priest, soldier, or commoner, tried to interpret the meaning of that horizon, the same inexorable thought returned, that the end of the empire was not merely a story of defeat but of revelation, a lesson written in fire, smoke, and silence, teaching that no matter the power accumulated, no matter the pride displayed, no city, no empire, no civilization is beyond the reach of time, fate, and human frailty. And it is within this realization that the modern observer finds both awe and terror, for Rome's collapse, witnessed in that one unforgettable dawn, serves as a mirror, reflecting not only the fragility of human endeavor but the unending complexity of history itself, the interplay of choice, chance, and inevitability. And as the survivors continued to walk among the ruins, noticing the intricate details of their destroyed surroundings, the slightly tilted columns, the half-collapsed aqueducts, the silent statues whose eyes seemed to follow them with unspoken accusation, they understood that the story was far from over. That Rome's influence would seep into centuries to come, shaping nations, cultures, and ideologies. And that even in its absence, the eternal city remained eternal in spirit, haunting the minds of those who dared to remember, challenging them to discern between memory and myth, between history and legend, and as twilight approached, casting long shadows across the shattered forums and temples, the wind whispered secrets through broken archways, and for a moment it seemed that the past itself was speaking, reminding all who listened that while Rome may have fallen physically, its legacy, its lessons, warnings, and mysteries, would persist across time, forever imprinted on the horizon. And as night began to drape its deep indigo cloak over the remnants of Rome, the survivors found themselves caught in a liminal space between despair and the faint glimmer of survival, for the city's streets, once vibrant with the bustle of commerce and ceremony, now lay twisted and fractured, carrying the residue of chaos like a living memory pressed into every stone, every cracked pavement, and every splintered doorway. And among these ruins, whispers circulated not only of the Visigothic sack but of the inexplicable phenomena that seemed to accompany it, strange lights flickering at dusk where no fires burned, distant echoes of voices long gone, the sensation that unseen eyes observed the living with silent judgment, and in the minds of those who endured, an unsettling question took root: had the fall of Rome been merely a human catastrophe, or was there some unseen hand, some deliberate orchestration of fate that allowed centuries of pride, arrogance, and ambition to unravel in a single, brutal crescendo? And as they gathered in small groups within the shadowed halls of what remained of temples and palaces, the survivors shared fragmented stories, stories that grew into legends by necessity, as human memory struggled to comprehend the totality of loss. And in these stories emerged recurring figures, shadowy shapes glimpsed at the edge of vision, indistinct forms that seemed both observer and participant, figures who watched without interference yet whose presence conveyed an almost moral authority, and some whispered that these entities had been bound to Rome since its founding, custodians of a destiny that spanned centuries, guiding and punishing in ways imperceptible to mortal perception. And as dawn approached after that long, horrifying night, a pale light revealing further devastation, the human instinct to catalog and make sense of the chaos became urgent, for among the toppled columns, shattered aqueducts, and collapsed archways lay the tangible proof of stories that were otherwise intangible, fragments of documents, scorched letters, partially preserved scrolls, coins bearing the faces of emperors who had vanished from the earth, and relics of rituals performed in secret chambers whose purposes were now lost to memory. And those who could read and interpret these remnants realized that the fall of Rome was not only a matter of armies and weapons but of the delicate equilibrium between society, belief, and human decision, an equilibrium that had been disrupted incrementally over centuries until the tipping point was inevitable. And in the aftermath, as the survivors wandered through the devastated forum and the silent basilicas, they noticed subtler details that spoke of the empire's unraveling. Mosaics subtly altered by years of neglect, inscriptions worn in places that suggested deliberate erasure, gates that had been left unlocked, not by accident, but perhaps by the complicity of those who foresaw the empire's demise and acted to preserve certain outcomes for themselves or their descendants. And as they pieced these observations together, a larger pattern emerged, revealing a civilization not felled solely by foreign conquests but by an intricate interplay of ambition, fear, corruption, and human frailty, a network of choices and misjudgments that had made the physical destruction almost ceremonial, almost inevitable. And as the survivors contemplated the layers of history pressing down upon them, the horizon itself seemed alive, reflecting both the literal and metaphorical collapse, the mingling of sunlight with smoke, the mingling of past triumphs with present suffering, and in that mingling, a strange beauty could be perceived, a melancholy acknowledgement that even in destruction there was a narrative, a story of resilience and memory, and this story would be carried forward by those who lived, shaping the way future generations would perceive the eternal city and the lessons encoded within its rise and fall. And as evening descended again, wrapping the city in shadows, some survivors reported hearing sounds that defied explanation. The faint murmur of music echoing from the ruins of the Circus Maximus, the clatter of chariots that had not existed for decades, the distant cries of individuals whose lives had ended centuries before, as if the memory of Rome itself were replaying scenes for those willing to listen and comprehend. And in these auditory phenomena lay a deep, unsettling understanding that the empire's essence, its spirit, was not confined to its physical presence but lingered, a complex force interacting with time and human perception. And those who documented these occurrences, priests, scholars, and chroniclers alike, found themselves struggling to differentiate between hallucination born of trauma and the subtle, inexplicable logic of history speaking through the ruins. And in parallel with these supernatural impressions, tangible consequences began to unfold, for the survivors sought to rebuild, to gather what remained of commerce, law, and faith, to salvage order from chaos. And yet every act of reconstruction revealed the magnitude of loss. Trade routes disrupted for generations, aqueducts and roads destroyed, libraries reduced to ashes, population decimated, political structures in tatters. And within this devastation emerged new dynamics of power, feudal lords consolidating influence over small regions, the church increasingly filling the vacuum left by the disintegration of secular authority, and the collective consciousness of the Roman people slowly shifting, adapting to an existence in which the idea of Rome as a unified entity had become almost mythical, a memory to be revered, mourned, and feared. And in recounting these transformations, chroniclers emphasized not only the physical collapse but the psychological and spiritual dimensions, the pervasive anxiety, the uncertainty about divine favor, the constant awareness that the empire's disappearance was both punishment and lesson, and that in observing the ruins, one could trace patterns of human endurance, moral compromise, strategic ingenuity, and sheer chance, all converging in a single historical point that would resonate across centuries, a nexus of causality and consequence that scholars would later debate endlessly, a point from which the story of Europe's future could be traced. From the medieval kingdoms rising from the shadow of Rome, to the migrations that reshaped the continent, to the cultural and religious evolution that would carry fragments of Roman influence into new forms. And as the survivors moved cautiously through the streets that still smoked from the fires, they began noticing the subtler imprints of the empire's persistence. Walls that still bore inscriptions of civic pride, aqueducts that could still channel water, temples whose foundations hinted at knowledge and architecture yet to be matched. And in all these remnants, the realization dawned that while Rome had fallen, it had left behind a blueprint, a legacy, a reminder that civilization is never truly gone, as long as memory persists. And this memory would become the backbone of the next era, guiding rulers, inspiring poets, informing theologians, and haunting those who understood the delicate interplay of time, power, and human choice. And as night fell fully, the survivors, exhausted, haunted, and profoundly changed, gathered in scattered groups, reflecting not only on what had been lost but on what might emerge from the ruins. And in that contemplation, a sense of continuity and hope, however fragile, began to take shape, as though the fall itself had become a teacher, a force reminding humanity that even in devastation, lessons endure, shaping thought, governance, culture, and belief for generations, a silent, persistent testament to the endurance of memory against the inexorable march of destruction. And through this awareness, the city's legacy persisted, haunting, instructive, and eternally present across the horizon. And yet beyond that dim edge where the last rays of the dying sun dissolved into the black canopy of approaching night, there stirred currents unseen, for Rome's collapse was not only an event confined to stone and fire, to the temporal markers of conquest and ruin, but rather an opening, a tearing of veils between epochs. And those who lingered on the outskirts of the smoldering city felt this more than they could articulate. a pressure in the air, a density in their dreams. As if history itself had thickened and was demanding to be noticed, and thus the survivors carried with them not only hunger and grief but an unshakable awareness that what they had endured was but the surface of something vaster, a tremor echoing from antiquity into futures yet unwritten, and in that tremor there lay the seed of new orders, new faiths, new tyrannies, and new hopes, for though Rome had fallen outwardly, internally its essence dispersed like sparks from a great conflagration, embedding themselves in the minds and institutions of those who walked away from the ashes. And so when the first attempts at resettlement began, small clusters of families forming protective circles in ruined villas, priests consecrating makeshift altars where once emperors had paraded, ex-soldiers swearing oaths of brotherhood beneath collapsed arches, it was not the birth of something entirely new but the reweaving of threads already ancient, reshaped now by calamity into patterns unrecognizable yet continuous, and in this weaving, certain myths began to crystallize. Myths that explained to commoners why Rome's gods had remained silent, why the Christian deity had allowed his city to be pillaged, why the mighty legions had scattered into dust, and the answers differed, some saying the empire had decayed in its soul long before the walls crumbled, others claiming Rome was sacrificed as an offering to time itself, that all great powers must be harvested by the scythe of inevitability. And still others whispered darker stories, of secret cults who had bargained with unseen entities, trading Rome's survival for knowledge that would shape centuries hence, and these whispers spread like smoke, seeping into monasteries, into merchant caravans, into the halls of petty kings rising in the vacuum, until the memory of Rome was not one memory but many, refracted into countless interpretations, each wielded as justification for power. And thus the ruin became more alive in imagination than it had ever been in reality. For each fragment, a coin, a statue's broken face, a scrap of marble from the forum, was not merely debris but an artifact charged with symbolic electricity, capable of invoking both dread and aspiration, and those who held such remnants began to see themselves as inheritors of destiny, whether they were barbarian chieftains seeking legitimacy, bishops declaring Rome's fall a divine lesson, or wandering philosophers recording visions half mystical, half historical, and as these interpretations multiplied, the horizon itself, that perpetual symbol of what lies beyond reach, grew heavier with Rome's shadow, for travelers crossing the Alps spoke of hearing phantom trumpets in the wind, monks in Irish cloisters dreamt of Latin phrases whispered by ghostly voices, desert hermits in Egypt recorded visions of a city both ruined and eternal, shimmering like a mirage between presence and absence, and these fragments, though disconnected, converged into a single realization, that Rome's collapse had not ended Rome, but had dispersed it across the world like seeds carried by a storm, each root sprouting differently according to the soil, and thus medieval Europe began to gestate in the womb of apocalypse, its heartbeat audible only to those who listened beyond ordinary perception, and among those listeners were individuals who sensed a darker continuity, that the fall had not cleansed but transformed, that the corruption and ambition that hollowed the empire had not perished but migrated, waiting to surface again in new guises, for the lust for dominion, the thirst for eternity, the manipulation of symbols, all these were immortal tendencies in human affairs, and so as the first fragile networks of feudal authority took shape, as villages huddled beneath castles, as markets re-emerged in shadow of ruin, the same old tensions stirred beneath, ambition disguised as duty, cruelty cloaked in piety, and memory itself wielded as weapon, and in this environment the church grew, swelling into the space left empty by the emperors, claiming to speak with the voice of both God and Rome, insisting that though the empire's marble had fallen, its soul had been baptized and survived in clerical form, yet others resisted, pagan cults lingering in forests and mountains, insisting that Rome's fall was not an ending but a proof that the old gods still reigned in shadows, and in these contested spaces legends flourished. Tales of hidden chambers beneath the ruins where ancient knowledge slept, guarded by spirits who demanded blood. or devotion, tales of emperors not dead but merely hidden, waiting in exile to return, tales of artifacts whose possession granted the authority once held by Caesars, and whether true or false, these stories sculpted imagination, pulling men and women into quests, into rebellions, into visions that blurred the line between reality and myth. And across generations the very memory of fire and sack became less an event and more a parable, a symbol invoked to warn kings of arrogance, to remind priests of divine judgment, to teach peasants the impermanence of earthly power, and thus the ruins became a school without walls, their curriculum written in stone and silence, and every traveler who stood before the shattered Colosseum or the broken aqueducts felt themselves students of that silent text, compelled to interpret, to find meaning, even if none was truly there, for humans cannot abide meaningless catastrophe. They must weave stories to contain the uncontainable, and so Rome endured, paradoxically more alive in absence than in presence, a ghost sprawling not only over Italy but over Europe entire, shaping law, shaping faith, shaping architecture, shaping thought, and all of this radiating outward from that night when flames consumed the eternal city, flames which in truth had not been extinguished but continued burning invisibly in memory, in legend, in ambition. A fire passed down through centuries, never quenched, never final, always smoldering just beyond the horizon. Horizon gave way to the darker vastness of night, and in that deep velvet expanse the survivors, the chroniclers, the dreamers, and the restless spirits of Rome began to project their grief and longing, their memories and fears, crafting an unseen architecture in the air, a phantom edifice of recollection and prophecy that rose like an invisible city above the ruins of the tangible one, for Rome, though reduced to stone shards and ashes, now existed in a parallel dimension of thought, of symbol, of spirit, where it could not be sacked by Visigoths or toppled by fire, and in this second life, this spectral continuation, it spread farther than the empire had ever spread in marble form, for whispers of its survival reached lands untouched by legions, and stories of its fall became metaphors carried in oral traditions, inspiring or warning those who had never seen the Tiber or the Seven Hills. And it was in this way that Rome's most profound conquests began only after its death. Not by force of arms but by the irresistible weight of myth, which pressed itself upon the imaginations of tribes, kings, monks, wanderers, and visionaries, shaping their sense of destiny, of legitimacy, of what it meant to inherit the fragments of a broken past. And as the centuries ticked forward, fragile yet unyielding, this invisible Rome found hosts in those who claimed to restore it, to revive it, or to surpass it, each claimant reshaping the phantom city into a mirror of their own ambitions, and thus Charlemagne, crowned centuries later in the fading light of the first millennium, was seen by his followers as the living continuation of Caesar and Augustus, his authority magnified by the echo of empire even though the empire itself lay shattered, and so too did the Byzantine emperors, who called themselves Romans though their tongue had become Greek and their dominion had retreated eastward. Yet they clung to the name like a talisman, knowing that to say, Rome, was to invoke a legitimacy that transcended geography, and beyond them, the popes of the Latin Church wrapped themselves in Rome's mantle, proclaiming that though emperors fell, the Church was the eternal custodian of what Rome had truly meant, baptizing the ruins into sacred permanence, and all the while, among the common people, stories twisted and flourished, stories of hidden treasures buried beneath the forum by priests fleeing the sack, stories of the Sibyls whose prophecies had foreseen the fire, stories of forgotten legions wandering still in misty valleys of the north, unable to accept the empire's end, and in these tales Rome became less a place than a living riddle, an inheritance both cursed and blessed, demanding interpretation, and so it endured in the most human of ways, as memory braided into imagination, refusing erasure, demanding continuation. And in that continuation new forms of power arose, some noble, some corrupt, some drenched in blood, yet all carrying in their marrow the undying pulse of the fallen city, a pulse that beat in monasteries copying Latin texts by candlelight, in fortresses where petty kings styled themselves heirs to Roman glory, in pilgrim routes that converged on basilicas built atop pagan temples, in the laws that still quoted Justinian's code, in the arches, columns, and aqueducts that even in ruin dictated how stone must be cut, how cities must be planned, how authority must be visualized. And so invisible Rome taught lessons long after tangible Rome had burned, and in that teaching it reshaped the destiny of continents, for without the memory of its greatness and collapse, Europe would not have dreamed of unity, of empire, of resurrection. And it is in this paradox that Rome's truest power lay, that it became stronger, more eternal, in death than it had ever been in life, for no living empire can escape decay, but a dead empire, if remembered, if mythologized, can haunt eternally, and this haunting spread into languages, into rituals, into the very architecture of thought, so that even centuries later, in castles and cathedrals, in manuscripts and councils, men spoke of themselves as Romans, as inheritors of an eternal flame, though their Rome was but a ghost, a constellation of memory that glowed in the heavens of imagination, untouchable, unassailable, eternal. And this is why when the pilgrims of later centuries approached the ruins, they did not see only stones but scripture, they did not see only ashes but omens, and they did not mourn only what was lost but trembled before what still lived, alive not in brick but in the marrow of civilization itself, in the patterns of authority, the visions of empire, the faith that order could be wrested from chaos. And so as the Middle Ages deepened, as darkness and light alternated across the centuries, the phantom of Rome continued to walk among men, sometimes as teacher, sometimes as tyrant, sometimes as a silent witness, its presence undeniable, its meaning inexhaustible, and those who sensed this truth most keenly understood that history was not linear but circular, that the fall of Rome was not an end but a recurrence, an archetype that would repeat again and again. For every empire carries within it the seeds of its own sack, every civilization the tremor of its own collapse. And in Rome's fiery death men saw not only the past but the mirror of all futures, and thus the lesson of Rome was never finished, never concluded, but continually reborn in each generation that stood amid ruins and wondered how permanence dissolves into dust. And so the story continued, spiraling outward into every corner of the known world, unbroken, unending, and still echoing in the silence of the night where memory and myth converge into eternity. Eternity was not silence but expansion, for in the centuries that followed the ruin of the eternal city the resonance of Rome did not fade into the background of history but spread like concentric ripples upon a boundless sea, touching distant shores with echoes that transformed villages into kingdoms, tribes into nations, wanderers into visionaries, and faith into empire. For what the sack of Rome ignited was less the death of a civilization than the release of a force uncontainable, a kind of psychic inheritance that clung to every broken statue, every line of Virgil or Cicero copied by trembling monastic hands, every road that stretched across Europe like a memory carved into earth. And as the people of later centuries knelt before crucifixes or bowed to kings or marched beneath banners stitched with new symbols, the invisible weight of Rome pressed upon them, a reminder that power could be organized, centralized, justified, sanctified, and remembered, and so men and women born generations after the fire still lived beneath its glow, even if they could not articulate the shape of the ghost, for in their laws, their architecture, their sense of destiny, and even in their nightmares Rome endured, reshaped yet unbroken, a phoenix that refused final ashes. And this persistence raised profound questions among thinkers who gazed at ruins by day and dreams by night. Was the fall of Rome truly a collapse? Or was it an alchemical transformation, a transference of essence from stone into spirit, from empire into myth, from temporal dominion into eternal archetype? And if so, what did that mean for those who inherited it? Were they heirs to glory or to a curse, inheritors of order or of hubris, guardians of civilization or prisoners of a specter that would never release them? And so philosophy and theology wrestled with this riddle. Augustine, writing in the shadow of sack that the city of man must always yield to the city of God, yet his words themselves became a cornerstone of Europe's later faith, proof that even as Rome's marble crumbled, its intellectual foundations could be recast into new cathedrals, and the debate deepened through centuries as monks preserved Latin texts, as scholars rediscovered Aristotle through Arabic translations, as wandering poets invoked Troy and Rome as twin mirrors of destiny, and in each invocation the ghost city flickered more brightly. Not as nostalgia but as a force shaping the future, compelling rulers to cloak themselves in Roman imagery, compelling churches to sit on Roman stones, compelling merchants to walk Roman roads, compelling the very imagination of Europe to orbit around an empire no longer present yet more present than ever. And so when knights rode forth on crusade, they marched not only under the cross but beneath the shadow of Rome. When kings crowned themselves in Aachen or London or Paris, they sought legitimacy through a chain that led back to Caesar's. And even when rebels rose against emperors and popes, they defined themselves through the Roman idea they resisted, for there was no escaping the inheritance. It had woven itself into the marrow of identity, an invisible thread binding the chaos of feudal age into a tapestry still shimmering with imperial resonance. And as centuries passed, the paradox only deepened, for while Rome's body was scattered into fragments, its soul multiplied into countless vessels, in Byzantium calling itself the Second Rome, in Moscow declaring itself the Third Rome, in Papal Rome asserting itself as eternal custodian, in Renaissance humanists reviving Latin purity, in modern republics invoking Roman law and Senate, in every structure of power that sought both authority and permanence. And yet behind all these manifestations lingered a darker current, a suspicion whispered in cloisters and sung by bards, that Rome's true essence was not benevolent but haunted, that it carried with it the arrogance that defied gods, the hubris that built monuments as if they could defy time, the cruelty of legions that sowed salt into conquered lands. And so to inherit Rome was not only to inherit order but to inherit decay, not only to wear the crown of civilization but to carry the seed of collapse. And this duality, glory and ruin entwined, became the eternal lesson that shaped the medieval and modern mind. For every castle built upon Roman stone trembled with the memory of how even the mightiest fortress may fall, and every republic, modeled on Roman Senate, whispered with the ghost of civil wars that shattered the republic of old. And thus Rome's endurance was not simple nostalgia but a living dialectic, a tension that both inspired and warned, a paradox that refused resolution, a riddle carved into the very identity of the West. And in the endless retelling of this riddle, myths sprouted like wildflowers. Myths of emperors asleep in mountains awaiting return, myths of libraries buried beneath ashes preserving secret wisdom, myths of relics that could summon Rome's power, myths of curses that doomed any who dared to call themselves Caesar. And these myths, though cloaked in fantasy, shaped the actions of kings and peasants alike, guiding quests, wars, pilgrimages, and visions, until history and legend could no longer be separated, and Rome lived less as a fact than as an inexhaustible story, a narrative that every generation rewrote, extended, and claimed as its own. And this is why the ruins, even when silent, never cease speaking, their silence louder than the clamor of new empires, their emptiness fuller than the crowded markets of feudal towns. For to stand before a broken arch was to stand before the proof of time's dominion, and yet also before the proof of memory's defiance, a simultaneous vanishing and persistence, a paradox that made the stones not relics but oracles. And those who touched them felt the weight not only of history but of destiny, as if by holding a shard of marble one could hold the pulse of civilizations unborn. And thus Rome's true empire extended beyond its borders, beyond its years, into the realm of human imagination where no sack could reach. And it was in this imagination that new empires gestated, for without Rome's ghost, would Charlemagne have dreamed of a holy empire? Would Byzantium have clung to its Roman name? Would Papal Rome have dared to declare itself eternal? Would Renaissance Florence have revived the Republican ideal? Would America centuries later have called it Senate and its ego Roman, would modern Europe have envisioned union as a resurrection of old imperial order? Perhaps not, for Rome was the seed of these dreams, a seed watered not only by memory but by myth. And as long as men dreamed, Rome lived, transformed, reinterpreted, haunting the corridors of power and the recesses of the soul, unending, inescapable, eternal, yet always fragile. For the same memory that inspired could also curse, the same ghost that legitimized could also accuse, whispering into the ear of every emperor, every pope, every ruler, "Remember, you too shall fall, as Rome fell," and in that whisper lay both humility and terror, a reminder that no permanence is permanent, that eternity itself is but a reflection trembling upon the waters of time, fragile, shifting, yet never gone. And so the story of Rome continued, not in stone, not in flame, but in the ceaseless unfolding of human destiny, which even now bends beneath its shadow, and will bend as long as memory endures, as long as ruins stand, as long as men dream of empire and fear its loss. For Rome is not past, it is archetype, not dead but transformed, not silence but echo, and its echo shall resound until the very end of history itself, when memory and myth at last converge into a final judgment beyond the grasp of men but already inscribed in the essence of their longing, their fear, and their hope. For Rome's collapse was never conclusion, but the eternal prologue of civilization's story, a story still unfolding across every land touched by its shadow, and perhaps even beyond, into realms unseen, where empire and eternity intertwine without end. End was never truly an end but a transformation, for what men perceive as finality is in truth only a threshold, and so the story of Rome beyond its apparent conclusion began anew with every generation that touched its ruins, spoke its tongue, or dreamed its dreams, and in that endless rebirth the empire transcended time, no longer bound to the chronology of emperors or the cartography of legions, but woven instead into the very psychology of civilization, a current running beneath the surface of all later ages, shaping their visions, their fears, their ambitions, their philosophies, and even their rebellions, for to rebel against Rome was still to be defined by Rome, as shadow is defined by light, and so whether one sought to restore its glory, surpass its might, or curse its memory, the act itself testified to its survival, an endurance more formidable than marble walls or iron swords, for walls and swords may crumble, but the idea that once they stood persists indestructible, and thus Rome became less a fallen city than a perpetual idea, an archetype imprinted upon the collective imagination, carried like a seed across oceans and generations, germinating in places the legions never marched, flowering in minds that never saw the Tiber, and in this flowering it mutated, adapted, hybridized with local myths and faiths until there were not one but countless Romes. The Rome of Christian visionaries who saw it baptized into the city of God, the Rome of Germanic kings who draped themselves in its tattered purple to legitimize rule, the Rome of Byzantine emperors who insisted the empire had never ended but only transformed, the Rome of Islamic scholars who inherited its sciences and philosophies, the Rome of Renaissance humanists who dusted its texts from monastic silence and breathed into them a second life, the Rome of Enlightenment thinkers who reimagined its republic as a model for modern freedom, the Rome of revolutionaries who invoked its Senate and its people, the Rome of architects who drew upon its columns and domes, the Rome of poets who sang of its fall as a warning and of its grandeur as an aspiration, and even the Rome of conquerors like Napoleon and Mussolini who wrapped themselves in its ghost to clothe ambition with destiny, each Rome distinct, contradictory, yet all bound to the original city that still lay in ruins yet refused to lie silent. And this multiplicity revealed a deeper truth, that Rome was no longer a single civilization but a mirror held up to humanity itself, reflecting our eternal struggle with power, with order, with mortality, with memory, and it was in this mirror that kings and commoners alike glimpsed their place in history, for Rome's greatness was never separate from Rome's fall, and its fall was never apart from its greatness, Together they formed a dialectic that defined the very possibility of civilization. Whispering to each age that to build is also to decay, that to expand is also to overreach, that to command is also to invite rebellion, and yet that even decay, overreach, rebellion, are never the end, only transformations, only preludes to further echoes, further embodiments, further rebirths. And so the empire of memory proved greater than the empire of stone, because memory is unbound by borders, unshackled by armies, carried effortlessly across centuries, across languages, across oceans, into hearts that never knew its original shape yet felt its gravity, and that gravity became visible in countless subtle ways, in legal codes that still cite Roman law as bedrock of justice, in languages descended from Latin that carry its rhythm in every sentence, in roads that beneath modern asphalt trace ancient lines, in aqueducts whose ruins taught new engineers the genius of water's command, in architecture whose domes and arches became signatures of authority, in rituals of coronation and councils of governance, in the very notion of empire itself as something to be feared, imitated, or resisted, for even those who sought to reject empire altogether framed their rejection in Roman terms, declaring liberty as the rebirth of the Roman Republic, imagining republics as heirs to SBQR, summoning Roman imagery to justify their departure from Roman power, and thus Rome proved inescapable, its ghost inseparable from the dream of politics, its shadow inseparable from the light of progress. And so humanity's relationship with Rome became less a chapter of history than an endless conversation, an argument never resolved but endlessly fruitful, for from its ruins philosophers drew meditations on mortality, from its grandeur rulers drew blueprints of dominion, from its cruelty rebels drew reasons to resist, from its persistence poets drew metaphors of eternity, and in each new articulation Rome was reborn, different yet the same, diminished yet magnified, silent yet speaking, dead yet living, and this paradox was not merely an intellectual game but a profound spiritual reality for countless souls who stood before its ruins, whether pilgrims or artists or emperors or wanderers, each sensing that these stones, though broken, radiated a force beyond their material, a force that compelled awe, compelled humility, compelled imagination. And this compulsion was the true empire, the dominion of memory over flesh, of myth over history, of archetype over chronology. And so long as men and women dream, so long as they imagine greatness and fear collapse, Rome will endure, not as nostalgia but as necessity. For without Rome the story of civilization would lack its archetype, its caution, its aspiration, its haunting, its promise. And perhaps this is why even in lands far removed, in cultures untouched by legions, echoes of Rome appear, as if the archetype has transcended its origin, becoming not merely Roman but human, for every society that rises, builds, expands, confronts collapse, and seeks to endure finds itself reenacting Rome's drama in miniature, and in that reenactment Rome lives again, each time transformed, each time reborn, never ending, forever beginning, the eternal prologue to every empire, every republic, every dream of permanence carved into the shifting sands of time, until the very concept of civilization itself cannot be spoken without Rome lurking within it, unseen yet undeniable, the ghost that is not ghost but essence. Not ruin but seed, not past but perpetual presence, reminding us that we too, like Rome, are builders of echoes, heirs of myths, authors of eternities, and that in our own fall, as in Rome's, there may yet be not silence but transformation, not ashes but phoenix, not end but endlessness, for the empire of memory has no final dusk, only eternal dawns. Dawns are never singular but layered, each horizon containing not one but infinite beginnings. And so from the twilight of Rome into the dawns of the world that followed there unfolded not a mere continuation but a vast multiplication of destinies, for the collapse of an empire had seeded 1,000 empires of thought, 1,000 empires of dream, and these dawns stretched across centuries like constellations, each glowing with a different hue yet all connected to the eternal axis of that ancient city whose shadow could not be banished. And in these dawns humanity discovered both its greatest aspirations and its deepest anxieties. For Rome was no longer a city nor a state but a metaphor of existence itself, a cipher through which each new civilization translated its own struggles with mortality, order, ambition, and transcendence. And so as the medieval dawn rose, it was Rome's ghost that gave kings their crowns and priests their pulpits, for the papacy itself claimed the mantle of Rome eternal, declaring that though the Caesars had fallen, the Petrine throne endured, and from this claim sprouted cathedrals that rivaled amphitheaters, councils that echoed senates, crusades that marched as legions once had, and in these echoes the medieval world found both strength and torment. For the shadow of empire lingered over feudal fields, reminding peasants that power could unify but also crush, and reminding lords that every castle could crumble as surely as the Colosseum. And when Byzantium lit its domes with golden mosaics, it proclaimed itself the Second Rome, refusing to admit that history had shifted westward. And when its walls finally cracked under Ottoman cannon fire, a new claimant, Moscow, rose to declare itself the Third Rome, bearing the prophecy that no fourth would ever come, and thus the dawn stretched eastward, carrying with it a vision of sacred empire that sought permanence against the tide of centuries. Yet permanence remained a phantom, for even as the Orthodox Tsars clothed themselves in imperial vestments, new dawns opened elsewhere, in Florence, Venice, and the cities of Renaissance Italy, where Rome was resurrected not as throne but as text, not as sword but as pen. As humanists bent over parchment to rediscover Cicero's cadences and Virgil's visions, declaring that man himself was measure, that history itself could be reborn. And so the ruins of Rome became classrooms where new generations learned not despair but revival, where broken columns whispered not of endings but of possibilities. And thus another dawn opened, the dawn of modernity, where republics were no longer myths but aspirations, where the Senate became more than ruin but blueprint, where the idea of liberty clothed itself in Roman garments, carried across oceans by revolutionaries who named their capitals after Caesars, who adorned their institutions with eagles and laurel wreaths, who declared that the spirit of SPQR breathed again in their assemblies. And yet this too revealed the paradox of Rome, for even liberty was haunted by empire, and every republic carried within it the seed of domination. Every freedom the temptation of conquest, and so Napoleon crowned himself with Caesar's laurels, Mussolini dreamed of fascist revival, Hitler plundered Roman eagles for his legions, America built its Senate upon Roman columns, Europe stitched itself in, and in this dialectic humanity found its truest mirror, seeing in Rome not merely a city but itself, its destiny, its fragility, its eternity. And so in each new century Rome was less remembered than relived, less studied than embodied, appearing in art, in law, in language, in architecture, in myth, until to speak of civilization was already to speak of Rome, whether one knew it or not. And even in lands the legions never touched, China with its dynastic cycles, India with its empires of Dharma, Africa with its kingdoms and cities, the Americas with their republics, the archetype of rise and fall, of grandeur and ruin, of memory and transformation carried the same resonance, as if Rome had ceased to be local and become universal, as if in its collapse it had scattered seeds to every horizon, seeds that sprouted whenever men built cities and dreamed of eternity. And so the dawns multiplied without end, each carrying Rome within them like an unshakable ghost, each proving anew that the true empire was not geographical but metaphysical, not the dominion of territory but the dominion of imagination, not an empire of stone but of story. And this story, though written in Latin once, was now written in every tongue, each translation a transformation, each adaptation a rebirth. And in this endless rebirth Rome achieved what no legion ever could, immortality not of walls but of meaning, not of Caesar's crown but of civilization's soul. And thus the question lingers, are we not still Romans, even now, in our laws, our dreams, our architecture, our republics, our tyrannies, our very sense of history as rise and fall, dawn and dusk, ruin and rebirth? And if so, does that not mean that Rome has never ended, that we ourselves are its continuation, its unfinished chapter, its latest dawn, destined one day also to become its latest dusk, and in that dusk, perhaps, another people will look back upon our ruins and whisper that they too live in our shadow, just as we live in Rome's. And thus the circle of dawns continues, eternal, inexhaustible, unbroken, as long as memory endures and men dream of empire beneath the shifting heavens. Heavens themselves, vast and unknowable, became the silent witnesses to the perpetual cycle of empires rising and collapsing, of dreams expanding and contracting, of civilizations scripting their glories upon the fragile surface of time. And though each people gazed upward imagining constellations unique to their mythologies, the heavens remained impartial, eternal, indifferent, a canvas upon which humanity projected both destiny and doom. And it was within this cosmic backdrop that the legacy of Rome acquired an almost celestial permanence. For just as stars long extinguished still shone upon earth with light delayed by distance, so too did Rome's brilliance radiate across millennia, its energy unspent though its material form had crumbled. And beneath these heavens new societies, new nations, new empires could not help but define themselves in relation to that immortal archetype, some consciously claiming inheritance, others unconsciously repeating patterns, yet all bound by the gravity of its myth. And thus as the medieval centuries dissolved into the early modern age, the Renaissance into enlightenment, enlightenment into revolutions, revolutions into industrial empires, and industrial empires into the modern global order, the heavens looked down upon a drama endlessly reenacted, the dream of eternity, the hubris of expansion, the inevitability of decline, the persistence of memory. And in this grand theater Rome remained the ghost actor no script could omit, because its presence had shifted from historical fact to metaphysical necessity, the eternal model of civilization's promise and peril. And so even as oceans were crossed and continents conquered, as cities rose with glass towers that pierced the clouds, as machines replaced legions and satellites replaced messengers, still the whisper persisted, this too is Rome, in another guise, another dawn, another fragile claim upon the infinite. And just as the Caesars once believed themselves masters of the world only to learn the world masters all, so too do modern powers strive with certainty while the heavens watch in silence, knowing that all human ambition, however mighty, is but dust before eternity. And yet it is precisely this dust that dreams. And in its dreaming builds worlds, writes laws, erects monuments, and dares to imagine permanence. And in this daring lies the essence of Rome, an essence not bound to the Palatine or the Tiber but woven into the human condition itself, the need to order chaos, to impose narrative upon time, to bind fleeting generations into something resembling immortality. And so Rome's survival is not merely historical but existential, for whenever a man or woman looks upon ruins, whether shattered temples, abandoned factories, crumbling skyscrapers, they are struck by the same paradox. That defined Rome, that greatness and fragility are twins, that endurance and collapse are inseparable, that to build is already to foreshadow ruin, and yet to ruin is also to nourish memory, and memory itself is a structure more enduring than stone, a temple no fire can consume, a senate no barbarian can sack, a forum no age can silence. And so as the heavens turned over centuries, as the stars shifted and generations passed, the circle of dawns widened, drawing within it America declaring itself a new Rome, Russia declaring itself the last Rome, Europe declaring itself the reborn Rome, Asia and Africa inheriting the Roman sciences of law and architecture, South America inscribing republicanism upon its constitutions with Roman echoes. And each declaration, each constitution, each building of marble or steel, became a testament that the idea was alive, that Rome was never corpse but current, never ruin but reservoir. And yet the heavens remind that even currents dry, reservoirs empty, dawns dissolve into night, and so the cycle must continue, and in this eternal recurrence lies the deepest truth of Rome's afterlife. It is not eternal because it never falls, but eternal because it always falls and always rises, always dies and always is reborn. And this rhythm mirrors not just civilization but existence itself, for are we not all Romans in our own lives, building small empires of family, of ambition, of memory, only to see them crumble with time, yet leaving behind fragments, stories, influences, seeds that sprout in those who follow? And is this not the essence of human immortality, to live not forever in body but forever in the echoes of others, as Rome lives in us, in our words, our architecture, our laws, our philosophies, our very imagination of what civilization means? And so the heavens bear witness not merely to Rome but to humanity itself, inscribing upon their silence the eternal truth that memory is stronger than stone, story more enduring than empire, and in that endurance Rome remains, vast, unbroken, eternal, woven into every dawn that ever was and ever will be beneath the indifferent, eternal heaven. Heaven which, though silent and immeasurable, became the mirror in which humanity projected not merely its myths but its very essence, for in the stillness of the stars mankind discerned both its vulnerability and its magnificence, its finitude and its striving toward eternity. And in this duality Rome's shadow lengthened far beyond the Palatine, far beyond the ruins of amphitheaters and aqueducts, embedding itself into the very rhythm of human existence, because each civilization that rose after Rome found in its story both a prophecy and a warning, a prophecy that greatness could be attained by sheer will, discipline, and vision, and a warning that no greatness, however vast, was immune from the entropy of time. And thus when kings crowned themselves with titles echoing Caesar, when republics raised their senates with marble colonnades, when ideologies armed themselves with eagles and standards, they were not merely imitating a past but reenacting a drama written into the marrow of humanity. And in this reenactment the heavens stood as impartial witnesses, gazing upon each attempt at permanence with the same starlit indifference, for to the cosmos all empires were sparks across an abyss, luminous yet fleeting, yet to men those sparks felt eternal. And so they built and fought and dreamed as though their order would never end, and in this very illusion lay the power of Rome's ghost. For Rome became not just history but destiny, not just ruins but recurrence, not just memory but metaphor, and as centuries unrolled into the Renaissance, where Florentine pens resurrected Cicero's cadences and sculptors revived marble bodies with Roman perfection, and into the Enlightenment, where philosophers echoed Stoic meditations and republicans dreamed of senates reborn, and into the revolutions of America and France where constitutions inscribed Roman concepts of citizenship, duty, and liberty, the heavens looked down upon a repetition so constant it became almost mythological, as though the very fabric of civilization could not escape Rome's orbit, as though to build any order was already to reenact the empire's rise and fall beneath the same eternal sky. And thus the 20th century too replayed the cycle, with Mussolini summoning the fasces, Hitler seizing the eagle, America shaping itself as a republic of senators, Russia proclaiming itself the Third Rome, Europe stitching together its union under Roman stars, all repeating the same hunger for unity, for order, for eternity. And yet the heavens bore witness to the same inevitable unravelings, for each empire carries within itself the seed of its dusk, the very forces of ambition that propel its rise also prepare its ruin. And so the eternal lesson of Rome is that eternity itself is an illusion, yet an illusion so vital that humanity cannot live without it. For without the dream of permanence no cathedral would rise, no city would endure, no law would be written, no memory would be preserved. And so the paradox becomes clear. Rome is eternal not because it endured in stone but because it endured in story, not because it avoided collapse but because collapse itself became part of its immortality. And thus when modern skyscrapers crumble, when digital archives fade into oblivion, when the nations of our time dissolve into future dust, they too will feed the same eternal rhythm. And their memory too will be Rome by another name, Another echo beneath this same indifferent heaven. Beneath that same indifferent heaven, the cycles of human endeavor unfolded with relentless regularity, and though each age believed itself exceptional, though each generation swore that its monuments, its systems, its technologies had broken free of the fragile destinies of its predecessors, the truth remained unaltered, that every achievement bore within it the seed of decline. Every triumph whispered already of its own undoing, and in that paradox the essence of Rome stretched like an unbroken thread through the corridors of history, tying together the ambitions of pharaohs, emperors, presidents, and prime ministers, for in the striving of mankind toward permanence the pattern remained ever the same, a ceaseless effort to fix the fleeting into something eternal, to press the vapor of a passing age into the marble of forever. And though men might carve their names into stone or inscribe their laws into digital archives, the heavens continued to remind them that permanence was a myth, and that myth itself was the most necessary illusion of all, because without it humanity could not summon the courage to build. And so Rome survived not in ruins but in recurrence, in every city that crowned itself eternal, in every senate that debated in columns, in every army that marched beneath eagles of iron or steel. And yet what few acknowledged was that Rome's greatest bequest to posterity was not its aqueducts or its legions but its rhythm of rise and ruin, a rhythm that replayed itself in the Ottoman courts that styled themselves Caesars of the East, in the glittering courts of Versailles where Louis XIV posed as Augustus in the mirror of Apollo, in the neoclassical halls of Washington where a republic of farmers dreamt itself a new Rome, in the stormy speeches of revolutionaries who wrapped themselves in republican virtue while sharpening the guillotine, and in the industrial empires of the 19th and 20th centuries that paved their roads and built their bridges as though Caesar himself had whispered the blueprints into their ears. And yet always, the heavens watched, silent and immense, bearing witness to the same tale, that power once seized will overreach, that order once constructed will decay, that glory once ascended will tumble into dust, and that dust will be gathered into story, and story will be Rome once again, clothed in a new guise, a new century, a new language. But always the same drama replaying beneath the stars. And if one looked closely at the modern world, one could see Rome's shadow everywhere, in the architecture of parliaments with their domes and columns echoing the Forum, in the legal codes that still bore the imprints of Justinian and the 12 Tables, in the very idea of citizenship and republics and senates that men and women spoke of without realizing they were invoking Rome's ghost, and yet that ghost was not benign, for it carried both inspiration and warning, reminding every age that in seeking permanence it also sowed its own impermanence. For who among the Caesars believed that the eternal city would one day be scavenged for stone by peasants, that basilicas would rise from the rubble of temples, that medieval cattle would graze where legions once paraded? And yet all this came to pass, and so too shall it be with us, for one day the glass towers of New York will fall as the Colosseum fell. The avenues of Washington will crack as the Via Appia cracked, the digital empires of our time will vanish as swiftly as papyrus in flame, and yet their memory, transmuted into myth, will persist, feeding the same eternal cycle. And thus Rome endures not because it avoided ruin but because ruin itself became its medium of survival. And so when humanity stares into the heavens and dares to imagine eternity, it is Rome's reflection that stares back, whispering that eternity is not a state but a story, not an unbroken empire but a rhythm of fall and rise, of dust and dream. And so, as long as humanity dreams, Rome shall live, beneath the same silent and indifferent heaven. Beneath the same silent and indifferent heaven the story continued, for if Rome's echo was eternal then its afterlife stretched not merely across centuries but across the very structure of thought, art, and imagination. And to trace its resonance into the marrow of modernity is to recognize that every act of building, every gesture of governance, every vision of universality carries within it some fragment of that Roman inheritance, whether acknowledged or not, because the dream of empire and the tragedy of its dissolution became templates engraved into the collective psyche, such that long after marble columns crumbled into lime and aqueducts sank into ruin, the idea of Rome became more indestructible than any fortress of stone, an idea that leapt from monkish scriptoria into Renaissance academies, from Enlightenment treatises into revolutionary manifestos, from battle standards into constitutional assemblies, so that the very rhythm of human civilization can be described as a constant oscillation between the Roman dream and the Roman warning, between the soaring ambition to unify, stabilize, and immortalize human order, and the inexorable unraveling that demonstrates time's dominion over all works of man. And yet in this oscillation something profound emerges, for mankind never abandons the attempt, never ceases to strive for permanence though permanence is denied. And it is precisely in this striving, this refusal to accept the transience of existence, that humanity reveals its most Roman character, the audacity to will eternity into being, even when eternity itself is no more than a mirage shimmering across the desert of time. Consider how deeply Rome's ghost pervades the structures of the modern world. The very notion of law as a codified body that stands above rulers, binding kings and commoners alike, is the Roman inheritance of the 12 Tables, expanded by jurists, crystallized by Justinian, and carried into the veins of Europe's civil codes, so that even today when judges in Paris, Berlin, Madrid, or even Latin America adjudicate disputes, they are unwittingly channeling the Roman spirit, not merely in legal form but in the conviction that order can be abstracted into rules, inscribed into permanence, and thereby survive the flux of political change. Likewise, the architecture of governance in modern republics remains inescapably Roman, for the very titles, Senate, Consul, Tribune, Citizen, recur in altered forms across constitutions, the domes of capitals rising like secular pantheons, their colonnades echoing the basilicas where praetors once dispensed justice, as if to govern is always already to reenact the Roman stage. And yet alongside the inspiration comes the warning, the reminder that the Republic gave way to empire, that liberty yielded to autocracy, that senatorial debates were drowned in civil war, and that even the Pax Romana, glorious in its scope, carried within it the brutality of conquest and the inevitability of decline. And so the paradox intensifies. To invoke Rome is to invoke both aspiration and caution, and thus each age remakes Rome according to its needs. Renaissance Florence saw in it the glory of eloquence and civic virtue. Enlightenment philosophers saw in it the grandeur of law and reason. Revolutionaries saw in it the fire of republican freedom, while dictators saw in it the majesty of order imposed by the sword. And yet none saw Rome as Rome itself was, for Rome has become less a memory than a mirror, reflecting back the desires, ambitions, and anxieties of those who gaze into it, such that Napoleon saw himself crowned with laurel like Augustus, while American revolutionaries envisioned themselves as stern Catos resisting tyranny, while Mussolini draped modernity in fascist fasces, while the European Union sought to be a peaceful empire echoing Roman unity without Roman violence. And in each case the heavens remained silent, indifferent, yet unyielding in their lesson, that to chase eternity is to court downfall, and yet to refuse the chase is to surrender the very spark of human greatness. The modern skyscraper cities, though gleaming with glass and steel, are but the colosseums and forums of our age, rising under the same illusion of permanence, their builders convinced that fiber optics and algorithms will outlast marble and parchment. And yet already the signs of entropy appear, the cracks in foundations, the obsolescence of codes, the vulnerability of data, the fragility of networks. And just as Roman roads, once symbols of invincibility, became overgrown paths trodden by shepherds, so too will our highways and satellites one day crumble into relics of a forgotten age, and in that ruin, future chroniclers will see the same cycle Rome bequeathed, the ascent, the zenith, the decline, and the afterlife in story, for what survives is not the empire but the narrative of empire, not the marble but the myth. And in that myth Rome is eternal because it is the story of eternity sought and eternity denied. Yet the question arises, why Rome, Why not Babylon, or Carthage, or the Aztecs, or the empires of China and India, each magnificent in their scope? The answer lies partly in Rome's universality, in its ability to absorb and transform the cultures it conquered, weaving Greek philosophy, Egyptian ritual, Celtic vigor, and Semitic faith into a mosaic that felt less like a single people and more like a microcosm of humanity itself, so that when Rome fell, it was not merely a city or an empire that perished, but an entire model of how human beings might organize themselves into a totality, a universum under law and order, and because it claimed universality, its fall became not the end of one people but the death and resurrection of a human dream, endlessly reenacted by successors who sought to don its mantle, whether Byzantium declaring itself the new Rome, or Moscow proclaiming itself the third Rome, or America casting itself as a republic reborn, or Europe uniting under stars that echoed the Roman heavens. And in each of these reincarnations one sees the persistence of Rome not as geography but as archetype, the archetype of civilization itself. But beneath this archetype lies a darker lesson, one inscribed in blood and ruin, that every civilization, however confident in its immortality, must yield to time, that progress does not abolish entropy, that conquest does not abolish mortality, and thus Rome is both inspiration and memento mori, reminding humanity that the higher it builds, the deeper its eventual fall, and yet without the building, without the striving, there is no human story at all, for to live as a human is to live as Rome lived, in defiance of time, in pursuit of eternity, knowing it will never be attained but refusing to surrender the dream. And so the cycle continues, beneath the same indifferent heaven, where the stars shine with the same cold light upon legions long turned to dust and upon skyscrapers destined for the same fate, upon emperors and algorithms alike, and the silence of the cosmos remains the same answer to every ambition, that eternity belongs not to empires but to the heavens themselves, and yet in striving to imitate that eternity, humanity reveals its truest grandeur, for though it fails, the failure itself becomes immortal in story, and the story is Rome, eternal because it is the very pattern of human existence, repeated forever under the gaze of the stars. Beneath the same indifferent stars the story pressed forward, stretching across ages as though time itself were merely the parchment upon which humanity scrawled its futile yet magnificent attempt at permanence. And if Rome had taught anything to the centuries it haunted, it was that no age, no empire, no republic, no digital dominion of code and screens could escape the gravity of that eternal rhythm of rise and decline. And thus to write of Rome was to write of all civilization, for Rome had ceased to be a city of marble and blood and had become instead the mirror in which every age gazed upon itself, seeing both its promise and its doom, its grandeur and its fragility. And this recognition bound the destiny of mankind as tightly as chains, though gilded with illusions of freedom, progress, and immortality. For the deeper one looked into Rome's shadow, the clearer it became that civilization itself was an act of defiance against impermanence, a colossal gesture hurled against the abyss of time, and yet the abyss, though silent, always won in the end, crumbling stones, scattering archives, erasing names, swallowing monuments in weeds and silence, but paradoxically never erasing the story, never extinguishing the myth, never silencing the ghost of Rome, which rose again in the language of law, in the architecture of domes and arches, in the rhetoric of liberty and duty, in the ruthless efficiency of legions reincarnated as armies of muskets, tanks, and drones, and above all in the human refusal to accept transience as final, for to be human was to rebel against death by imagining eternity, and Rome was the form that imagination most enduringly took, because Rome more than any empire embodied not a people but a pattern, not a geography but an archetype, the archetype of unity through law, strength through conquest, and glory through order. And so even in our digital present, where data streams across fiber optic networks and algorithms command more loyalty than kings, one can still see the Roman inheritance shining through, in the legal frameworks that govern trade and war, in the architecture of parliaments and capitals that mimic basilicas and forums, in the obsession with records and archives, in the military precision of modern states that echo legions on campaign, and in the ceaseless rhetoric of permanence, progress, and universality, which repeats the same illusion that animated Caesar and Augustus, that man can carve eternity into time with enough discipline, enough violence, enough vision, and yet beneath it all the same truth abides, that Rome fell, and so too will every order that follows. And if we extend this meditation further, we see how the Renaissance, that rebirth of light, owed its very name to Rome. For what did Florence and Venice and the scholars of Padua do but resurrect the corpse of Roman eloquence, reanimate Cicero and Seneca, rebuild domes in the image of the Pantheon, chisel statues in the perfection of Roman forms, as though eternity might be seized not by conquest but by memory. By returning to the shadow of Rome and drinking again from its vanished fountains. And this in turn flowed into the Enlightenment, where Voltaire and Montesquieu praised Roman reason, where Rousseau invoked republican virtue, where philosophers in salons spoke in the cadences of Cicero, unaware that their very dreams of liberty and citizenship were echoes of the Forum, and from there into the revolutions that tore monarchies down, where America crowned itself with a Senate and consuls disguised as presidents, and France wrapped itself in republican rhetoric even as it sharpened the guillotine, all the while gazing backward to Rome for legitimacy, for inspiration, for destiny, as though no new order could stand unless sanctified by the Roman archetype. And thus Napoleon crowned himself with laurel like Augustus, Mussolini marched under fasces, Hitler clutched the eagle, Stalin claimed Moscow the Third Rome, America proclaimed itself the new Rome of liberty. Europe stitched together its union beneath 12 stars like a secular zodiac, and all the while the stars above, cold and remote, gazed upon the same tragedy played again and again, ambition swelling into empire, empire collapsing into ruin, ruin fertilizing myth, myth igniting new ambition, until history itself resembled not a line but a circle, eternal recurrence in which Rome was less a chapter than the whole book written again and again in different tongues, under different skies. Yet always the same story told beneath the same heavens. For what is Rome if not the name humanity has given to its refusal to be forgotten? The Egyptians built pyramids, the Mesopotamians raised ziggurats, the Chinese unified under dynasties and built walls so vast they could be seen from the skies, the Mayans carved calendars in stone, and yet it is Rome, sprawling across the Mediterranean, which became the universal symbol of civilization itself, perhaps because Rome did not merely build but absorbed, did not merely conquer but codified, did not merely reign but recorded, turning conquest into law, turning chaos into system, and thus when Rome fell, the world felt not merely the death of a people but the shattering of the idea that order could be eternal, and yet in the very shattering lay its immortality, for the Middle Ages clung to its ruins, monks copied its texts, priests baptized its basilicas, emperors in Germany called themselves Holy Roman, and so Rome endured precisely because it could die, because it could be reborn, because its fall became the condition of its afterlife, its ruins the soil in which each new civilization planted its own dreams, and thus Rome never ends, for even in ending it continues, even in ruin it survives, even in silence it speaks, whispering to all who listen that to build is to imitate Rome, and to fall is to join Rome, and so the whole destiny of mankind is Rome's story retold under new banners, new technologies, new languages, but always with the same yearning for eternity, and the same submission to time. And if we turn our gaze to the future, what shall we see but Rome again, reborn not in marble but in silicon, not in legions of steel but in networks of light, not in emperors crowned in laurel but in corporations crowned in data, not in eagles of bronze but in satellites orbiting the indifferent heavens, yet the cycle remains unchanged, for already we hear the rhetoric of universality, of global order, of eternal progress through technology, as if digital Rome could escape the fate of marble. Rome, as if the empire of algorithms could defy entropy, and yet the same cracks already appear, the fragility of networks, the obsolescence of codes, the vulnerability of archives, the arrogance of power, the illusion of permanence. And so one day, when our towers of glass lie in ruins like the Colosseum, when our satellites have fallen like shattered statues, when our archives have burned like the libraries of Alexandria, our descendants will speak of us as we now speak of Rome, seeing in our ambition both greatness and folly, both inspiration and warning, and they too will call their story Rome, for Rome is less a place than a pattern, less an empire than eternity's shadow, repeating endlessly beneath the same indifferent heaven. Thus Rome is eternal not because its stones survived but because its story became the essence of human striving. And so long as humanity gazes at the stars and dares to build as though the stars themselves could be rivaled, so long shall Rome endure, not in marble, not in law, not in empire, but in the rhythm of aspiration and ruin, rise and fall, dust and dream, for beneath the same heaven all civilizations are Rome. And Rome is all civilizations, and the silence of the cosmos is the only true eternity, within which Rome glows forever as the brightest and most tragic of sparks. Beneath the same unyielding sky, the tale unfurled further, unbroken and ceaseless, like a river swollen with centuries of memory. For if Rome had bequeathed anything more enduring than aqueducts or legions or codes of law, it was the very shape of history itself, the architecture of destiny, so that even when we claim to move forward, we are but retracing the same arc inscribed by Rome's rise, Rome's zenith, and Rome's inevitable decline, and to meditate upon this is to feel the weight of millennia pressing upon the present, reminding us that every monument we erect, every system we invent, every dream of universality we nurture is haunted by that colossal precedent, so that even the most modern skyscraper is but an echo of a basilica, every constitution a shadow of the 12 tables, every republic an afterimage of the Senate, every army a reflection of the legions, and every empire a child born of Rome's ghost, yet none can escape the destiny written into the pattern, that entropy is the only conqueror, and time the only emperor whose reign has never ended, whose dominion swallows marble and steel, papyrus and parchment, silicon and glass, without distinction, though in the swallowing there remains the paradoxical gift of story, for though the works of man perish, the myth survives, and the myth of Rome has proven the most indestructible. Not because it resists decay but because it feeds upon it, because every ruin becomes a shrine, every collapse a new beginning, every echo a call for imitation, so that humanity, in seeking to surpass Rome, ensures that Rome is never surpassed, only reenacted in new guises, beneath new heavens, by peoples who may not even know they are Roman in spirit, yet who carry in their codes, their languages, their institutions, the imprint of that once eternal city. As if Rome had carved its essence not merely into stone but into the very DNA of civilization itself, ensuring that wherever humanity goes, into new continents, into new technologies, even into the stars, it will carry Rome as its shadow, its inspiration, and its warning. Consider how even now the languages of half the world trace back to Rome's tongue, the Romance languages stretching from Iberia to South America, the legal systems of continents structured upon Roman jurisprudence, the calendars by which we measure time descending from Julius Caesar's reforms, the alphabets of modern nations shaped by Latin letters, the architecture of parliaments, banks, and universities echoing colonnades and domes, the roads upon which our cars drive laid along ancient Roman routes, the military salutes, insignias, and eagles repeating gestures of forgotten centurions, and in every courtroom where judges speak of precedent, in every senate where debate is cloaked in rhetoric, in every capital crowned with a dome, Rome lives again, not as nostalgia but as foundation, not as ruin but as living marrow, and yet in this very ubiquity lies the danger. For to be Roman is also to be bound to Rome's fate, to the hubris that believed eternity could be legislated, that order could abolish chaos, that conquest could silence entropy, and in the end discovered that no law can annul time, no legion can defeat decline, No empire can survive forever, and yet this lesson, repeated endlessly, never extinguishes ambition, for humanity, in its most Roman impulse, refuses to yield, building again, codifying again, conquering again, dreaming again. So that decline itself becomes not the end but the fuel of renewal, and thus Rome becomes the name not of a city but of a cycle. The archetype of human striving and human failure locked together in an eternal dance beneath the stars. But what, then, of the digital age, which imagines itself liberated from the material decay that consumed marble and bronze? Are we not told that data is eternal, that the cloud preserves memory against fire and flood, that digital Rome will never fall because it exists nowhere and everywhere at once? And yet here too Rome whispers its warning, for what are archives of servers if not the fragile parchment of our time, subject to obsolescence, to corruption, to the silence that falls when power flickers, when empires of code collapse, when languages of programming vanish like Latin into the dust of disuse? And what are our vast digital forums, our social networks, our marketplaces, if not the reincarnation of the Roman Forum, teeming with rhetoric, spectacle, commerce, and manipulation, and, just as that forum echoed with both Cicero's orations and the demagoguery that destroyed the Republic, so too our virtual forums contain both the noblest aspirations of liberty and the basest eruptions of chaos. And just as Rome could not escape the forces of division, corruption, and entropy, either shall our digital Rome. For though fiber and algorithm seem untouchable, they too are bound to time, to collapse, to ruin. And one day archaeologists of the future will excavate fragments of hard drives as they now excavate shards of amphory, reading in our vanished networks the same tragic pattern of ambition undone by impermanence, the same story Rome told in stone now retold in code, reminding us that even our most modern eternity is but a mirror of the Roman dream, and thus a mirror of the Roman fate. Yet one must ask why mankind returns always to this pattern, why Rome holds such gravitational pull upon our imagination, why Babylon and Carthage, though mighty, fade into the background while Rome endures as the universal symbol of civilization's rise and fall. And the answer lies not merely in Rome's conquests but in Rome's universality. For unlike empires bound to single peoples or single rituals, Rome absorbed all, transformed all, synthesized all, weaving Greek philosophy, Egyptian ritual, Jewish law, Celtic vigor, Germanic strength, African wealth, into a single fabric that claimed to represent not a tribe but humanity itself. And thus when Rome fell, it was not merely a tribe that perished but the very idea of universal order. And so every later age, seeking to reimagine humanity as one, must reach back to Rome, for Rome remains the archetype of universality, of the world united beneath law, beneath order, beneath empire, and because it claimed to be eternal, its fall was eternal too, forever reenacted in successors that both imitate and betray it, Byzantium declaring itself the new Rome, Moscow the third Rome, America the Rome of liberty, Europe the Rome of unity, each inheriting both glory and ruin, each compelled to repeat the cycle that Rome inscribed into the fabric of human history, so that Rome endures not as past but as destiny, not as memory but as prophecy. Always ahead of us, always behind us, always within us, beneath the same stars that watched Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and now watch our own crossings of digital and cosmic frontiers. And if one gazes still further, beyond our present age of networks and algorithms, one sees the shadow of Rome cast even into the stars, for surely when humanity ventures beyond Earth, when colonies rise on the Moon or Mars or among the asteroids, their domes and councils will again echo the Senate and the Forum, their laws will descend from Justinian, their architecture from the Pantheon, their rhetoric from Cicero, their ambition from Caesar, their hubris from Augustus, and their decline will to be Roman, for the cycle cannot be broken, only expanded, so that the fall of Rome on earth becomes the template for the fall of Rome among the stars, and perhaps millennia hence, when Martian cities lie in dust and lunar archives lie shattered, future chroniclers will tell of them as we now tell of Rome, repeating the same eternal lesson, that mankind builds in defiance of time, but time always prevails. Yet the defiance itself is immortalized in story, and the story is Rome, forever retold. Under alien skies as under terrestrial ones, forever beneath the same indifferent heaven that watches empires rise, burn, and vanish into silence. Thus Rome is not merely a chapter of history but the grammar of history itself, the syntax by which human ambition is written, and so long as man refuses to accept impermanence, so long as he builds towers against the abyss, so long as he dreams of eternity though eternity is denied, Rome will endure, not as marble, not as empire, not as law, but as myth, as archetype, as destiny. For Rome is humanity and humanity is Rome, and both are bound to the same tragic grandeur beneath the eternal and indifferent stars. Beneath the same eternal and indifferent stars, where silence reigns more absolute than any emperor, the story pressed on into yet another unfolding, for Rome's shadow, having extended from antiquity into the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the digital present, now demanded to be traced further, into the very marrow of what it means to be human. Because if history itself has a grammar, then Rome is the subject and predicate, and if destiny has a script, then Rome is both prologue and epilogue. Written in cycles of ambition, triumph, decline, and myth, and thus to continue Rome's story is to continue humanity's own self-reflection, the recognition that no matter how far we advance into technological horizons, no matter how far we hurl ourselves into the galaxies, the imprint of Rome remains like a watermark on the parchment of civilization, subtle yet indelible, shaping every attempt at permanence, every declaration of eternity. And so this chapter, this part 17, emerges as a meditation, not merely upon Rome's endurance but upon its transformation into an eternal archetype, a ghost more powerful than any material empire, a ghost that infiltrates language, architecture, religion, governance, even imagination itself, such that Rome's true conquest was not of territory but of time, and in that conquest it revealed the paradox that to be eternal one must first perish. To be immortal one must first fall, for only in ruin can myth be born, and only in myth can universality be achieved, so that Rome's fall in the 5th century was not an end but a beginning, the moment when Rome ceased to be a city and became instead the condition of history, the template of all civilizations to come, the rhythm against which all human striving is measured. Consider how every later order has borne Rome's mark, whether knowingly or not. The Byzantine Empire, in calling itself the Second Rome, did not merely preserve Roman law and ritual but transfigured them into Christian universality, binding theology to imperial order. Islam, in conquering Roman provinces and inheriting Greek-Roman philosophy, became itself a custodian of Roman rationalism even while opposing Roman religion. The Carolingians crowned their kingship with the title, Holy Roman Empire. As though no crown could be legitimate without Roman sanction, the city-states of Italy in the Renaissance reimagined Rome as the fountain of eloquence and beauty, seeking to resurrect what they could never fully recover, and modern republics, from America to France, from Latin America to the European Union, clothed themselves in Roman vocabulary, as if no constitution could breathe without Roman lungs. No government could endure without Roman bones, and thus Rome continues, not as geography but as archetype, the universal mirror in which mankind sees both its possibility and its doom. Yet this endurance is no accident, for Rome achieved something no other civilization quite did. It universalized itself, claimed not merely to rule men but to rule mankind, not merely to dominate lands but to embody order itself, and when such a universal claim falls, it cannot vanish, because its fall becomes a question posed to all who come after. Can universality exist? Can permanence be achieved? Can humanity ever escape the cycle of Rome? And thus every age is compelled to answer, and in answering to reenact, and in reenacting to keep Rome alive. But if Rome is the template, the grammar, the archetype, then what does this mean for us who live beneath satellites instead of eagles, who gather not in forums but in digital networks, who fight not with gladii but with drones, who archive not in parchment but in clouds of data. Does it mean that we, too, are Romans, our skyscrapers but colonnades of glass, our constitutions but rewritings of the 12 tables, our senates but echoes of Cicero's forum, our emperors but CEOs crowned with algorithms instead of laurel wreaths? The answer, uncomfortably, is yes, for Rome was never merely a time or a place but a pattern, and in following that pattern we are Roman whether we acknowledge it or not, bound to the same cycle of expansion and fragility, ambition and collapse, and thus our belief that the digital age has broken free of entropy is the same illusion Augustus believed when he proclaimed an eternal Pax Romana. And just as that Pax dissolved into fragmentation, so too will ours, for no cloud is eternal, no code invincible, no empire immortal. And when our networks collapse, when our archives vanish into silence, when our monuments of steel stand in ruins like the Colosseum, our descendants will call us Rome, for Rome is not behind us but within us, repeating itself in every age, whispering that universality is a dream always chased, never caught, but never abandoned. Yet one might ask, why Rome above all? Why does Babylon not haunt us as Rome does? Why does the Aztec Empire not stand as archetype? Why do the dynasties of China, lasting longer than Rome, not hold the same mythic sway? The answer is that Rome combined in itself a unique alchemy of universality, adaptability, and visibility. It conquered not only lands but imagination, absorbing gods, languages, philosophies, and arts, creating a mosaic that seemed to mirror humanity itself. And in claiming eternity it inscribed its own fall into memory, for a fall that follows an eternal claim cannot be forgotten. It reverberates forever as warning and as challenge, and thus Rome became not merely a civilization but the story of civilization, the condensed parable of humans striving against time, and in this way Rome's fall was its greatest victory, for by dying it became immortal, by collapsing it became eternal. By failing it succeeded in becoming the myth through which all later ages understand themselves. And so, when one walks today beneath domes in Washington or Paris, when one reads codes of law in Berlin or Madrid, when one speaks in Romance languages, when one calculates time by a calendar shaped by Caesar, when one gazes at marble facades of banks and universities echoing basilicas, one is already inside Rome, already living in its afterlife, already repeating its story. And thus Rome persists not in stones but in us, in our habits, our institutions, our imaginations, and this persistence ensures that as long as humanity exists, Rome too exists, for Rome is humanity's name for its greatest defiance, the defiance of mortality through the illusion of eternity. And yet the stars remain indifferent. They watched as Rome rose from huts to empire, as emperors declared eternity, as aqueducts arched across valleys, as legions marched across continents, as basilicas and forums bustled with ambition, and they watched too as the walls crumbled, the aqueducts dried, the legions vanished, the forums silenced, and the stars did not change, did not answer, did not intervene, for eternity belongs only to them. And man's striving is but a flicker beneath their cold gaze, and yet it is in this striving that man becomes most human, for to build knowing one must fall, to strive knowing one must fail, to dream eternity knowing time will devour all. That is the grandeur Rome embodied, and that is why Rome is eternal, because it distilled into history the essence of humanity's tragic greatness, the refusal to yield to impermanence even as impermanence triumphs, the audacity to rival the stars though the stars remain unmoved, the grandeur of attempting the impossible, and the immortality of failing magnificently. Thus, beneath the same indifferent heaven, the tale goes on, for Rome has no end, only transformations, no death, only rebirths, no silence, only echoes, and as long as we continue to build, to legislate, to conquer, to archive, to dream, we are Rome continuing its long defiance against time, destined to fall, destined to endure, destined to be retold forever beneath the stars. The recognition that the true dominion of Rome was never the Mediterranean alone, nor the provinces it annexed, nor the legions it marched, but rather the imagination of mankind which once kindled cannot be extinguished. And here in this unceasing meditation the story bends and unfurls, carrying us across millennia. For to speak of Rome's persistence is to speak of every city that ever called itself eternal. Every empire that declared itself universal, every people that dared to believe they had finally surpassed the wheel of rise and fall, and yet like the marble columns that tumble, while still bearing traces of grandeur, so too do all successors crumble yet leave outlines of Rome behind, the ruins of ideals becoming the foundations of new architectures, until even in our age of satellites and silicon we find ourselves unknowingly Roman, for the very language with which we describe our polities and ambitions. The Republic, the Empire, the Senate, the citizen, are Roman words clothed in new skins, and the laws that adjudicate disputes across continents still bear Rome's imprint, and the idea that justice is written in reason not one was Rome's inheritance, and the notion that empire can unite the world under one order, though always a mirage, remains Rome's most seductive myth. And so humanity continues to march to rhythms Rome composed, yet fails to recognize how deeply those rhythms dictate its destiny. For even rebellion against Rome is but a form of obedience, a re-enactment of the archetype it authored, and so it is that in contemplating Rome we contemplate ourselves, our cities, our parliaments, our economies, our armies, our revolutions, our decadences, all of which are but different verses of the same eternal poem whose first stanzas were written by shepherds beside the Tiber who dreamt beyond their huts, and in daring to dream they birthed a myth no time could extinguish. A myth so immense that even its ruin became immortal, for here lies the paradox. That the greatness of Rome does not dwell in what survived intact but in what survived precisely because it was broken, for brokenness turned it into myth, and myth alone can defy entropy, and thus Rome became eternal by dying, became infinite by failing, became universal by collapsing, and in this inversion lies the deepest lesson of civilization, that to endure one must not resist ruin but transmute it into story, into archetype, into imagination that leaps from one age to the next, binding all into an unbroken cycle beneath the gaze of indifferent stars. For consider how this cycle has played across the centuries since the sack of the city in 410, when the Goths entered the Eternal City and the world trembled as if the sky had cracked, and yet Rome did not vanish in that night but diffused into 1,000 forms. The Church inheriting its authority, the Byzantines inheriting its law, the barbarians inheriting its titles, the scholars inheriting its texts. And through each transmission the essence of Rome persisted, and even as medieval peasants carted away marble from temples to build huts, they lived amidst Roman stones and breathed Roman air, for the ruins themselves radiated myth, whispering to every age that greatness is fragile yet unforgettable, that permanence is an illusion yet also the most necessary dream, and so the holy Roman emperors crowned themselves as Caesars, and popes raised basilicas as though continuing Augustus's program, and kings of France styled themselves heirs of Roman majesty, and when Columbus sailed westward it was with Roman confidence that the world could be encompassed, and when America declared itself a republic it draped itself in Roman language and symbolism, and when revolutions in Paris claimed liberty they invoked Roman virtue, and when tyrants raised armies to conquer Europe they too looked to Caesar, and thus in all guises Rome lived on, sometimes as inspiration, sometimes as warning, sometimes as disguise, but always as presence, until even today one cannot construct a parliament or a courthouse without pillars that recall the forum, cannot speak of law without echoing Justinian, cannot conceive of citizenship without recalling the Republic, and cannot imagine empire without imagining Rome, and thus whether in marble or in code, in parchment or in pixels, Rome persists as the skeleton of civilization itself. Yet the cycle demands not only imitation but collapse, not only glory but ruin, and here too every successor has followed the Roman pattern, for just as Rome overreached in ambition, So did Spain in its galleons, so did Britain in its colonies, so does America in its global reach, and so shall the digital empire in its invisible networks. And just as Rome's internal contradictions between republic and empire, liberty and autocracy, virtue and decadence, pulled it toward dissolution, so too do our own contradictions gnaw at the roots of our order, and in this sense we are already Romans at twilight, debating in our forums while the legions falter at the frontiers, convinced of our permanence while the indifferent heavens already count the years of our decline. And yet this recognition need not be despair. For if Rome teaches anything, it is that fall is not the end but the transformation. That the ruin of marble bursts the basilica, that the silence of forums bursts the manuscripts. That the collapse of one order becomes the seed of another, and thus our fall too shall not be oblivion but transfiguration into myth, into story, into archetype, and our skyscrapers when crumbled will be Rome once more, our networks when vanished will be Rome once more, our very ruins will be incorporated into the endless manuscript without final page, ensuring that the pattern continues, ensuring that myth is renewed, ensuring that Rome remains the eternal mirror. And what of the future, when mankind lifts beyond Earth into the cosmos? Here too Rome awaits, for every colony on Mars shall be Roman in its domes and its councils. Every city beneath alien skies shall legislate with Roman echoes. Every empire that spans planets shall imagine itself eternal and collapse in Roman fashion. And thus the cycle expands into the heavens, ensuring that wherever humanity travels it carries Rome's myth, Rome's ambition, Rome's tragedy, Rome's grandeur. For Rome is not geography but destiny, not marble but imagination, not a past but a prophecy. And so the saga flows forward, without end, beneath the same indifferent heaven where stars burn indifferent to the rise and ruin of empires, yet where mankind persists in dreaming eternity, persists in carving marble from time, persists in building Rome again and again. Forever the same story retold in different tongues, forever the same cycle repeated in different centuries, forever Rome, forever humanity, forever myth, forever beneath the indifferent stars, beneath those same indifferent stars, where silence is deeper than oceans and time moves with neither haste nor mercy. The thread of Rome's story does not conclude but coils forward into yet another dimension, for once we recognize that its dominion is not land but imagination, not soldiers but symbols, not provinces but patterns, then it becomes clear that Rome has never ended, nor can it end. For imagination once ignited cannot be extinguished. It burns not as flame but as ember buried in every epoch, ready to flare again when the winds of ambition and memory stir, and thus we find ourselves walking a road that is no longer chronological but eternal, a road where past and future blur, where Caesar walks beside digital architects, where Cicero's orations echo in parliamentary chambers, where Augustine's meditations live again in philosophical debates about consciousness and artificial minds. And on this road the ruins of the Forum are not relics but signposts, reminding every generation that civilization is not simply what is built but what is remembered, not merely what stands but what endures in imagination. And in this sense Rome has become the living marrow of history itself, the perpetual ghost that shapes all our architectures of thought, belief, and power. For when one looks at the towers of New York or Dubai, the bureaucracies of Brussels or Beijing, the legal codes that regulate commerce across continents, the idea of rights invoked by oppressed peoples, the shadow of empire wielded by nations both dominant and declining, one sees Rome not as museum but as bloodstream, not as corpse but as current, moving silently but irresistibly, compelling mankind to rehearse the same ambitions, the same contradictions, the same tragic arcs of glory and ruin. Consider, then, the curious paradox, that Rome's most enduring gift to us is not stability but instability, not permanence but the eternal cycle of rise and fall, for by universalizing itself it bound all successors into its archetype, teaching them to dream of eternity, and in dreaming to guarantee their eventual collapse, and yet in collapsing to guarantee their transformation into myth. Thus Babylon's grandeur faded, The Aztec temples fell, the dynasties of China transformed again and again, yet none of these haunt us as Rome does, because none transfigured their fall into such an unending archetype, none declared eternity so loudly that their ruin became universal scripture. And so, when we build colonies on Mars, when our networks span planets, when our descendants write new constitutions beneath alien suns, they will do so in Roman cadence, with Roman metaphors hidden in their tongues, believing themselves pioneers but in truth reenactors of the myth that shepherds beside the Tiber birthed when they dared to dream beyond huts and hills. And this realization is both humbling and terrifying. For it means that humanity cannot escape Rome, cannot transcend its archetype, but only reenacted upon larger stages, carrying the same cycle into the cosmos itself. Yet perhaps that is precisely the grandeur, that in Rome we glimpsed not merely one civilization but the very grammar of civilization, the syntax by which human ambition speaks itself across. And so the question deepens, if Rome is eternal because it failed, if its ruin transmuted into myth is what made it immortal, what then will be the destiny of our own world, of our skyscrapers and satellites, our databases and democracies? Are we not already Romans at twilight, convinced of permanence yet gnawed by contradiction, wielding global power yet trembling at internal decay, speaking of eternal peace while sharpening new weapons, proclaiming liberty while enthroning surveillance, believing ourselves unique yet rehearsing again the same paradoxes that toppled Caesars and shattered forums? And if so, then our fall too shall not be the end but another transformation, our ruins too will become myth, our silence too will become echo, absorbed into the eternal poem Rome began, the poem of rise and fall, of ambition and entropy, of dreams of eternity devoured by time yet reborn in story. For when our monuments crumble, when our code vanishes into the void, when our networks are forgotten dust, future generations will still recognize in our ambition the Roman imprint, will still call us Rome, will still measure us against the same eternal archetype, and thus our destiny is already written, not in stone but in imagination, not in archives but in myth, and in this recognition lies both despair and grandeur. For to be Roman is to be doomed and immortal at once, fragile as marble, yet eternal as story. Beneath the indifferent stars the cycle turns again, empires rise and collapse, yet Rome persists, not as a city, not as an empire, but as the eternal mirror of mankind's tragic defiance, the refusal to accept impermanence, the audacity to rival the stars though the stars remain unmoved, the grandeur of attempting the impossible and the immortality of failing magnificently. And so the saga flows forward without end, forever Rome, forever humanity, forever myth, forever beneath the indifferent stars dot, and the stars themselves seem to whisper across the canvas of the sky, as if each burning core carried within its trembling light the secret memory of ages that no book had dared to record. And as I stared deeper into that cosmic river I felt as though history itself was not linear but circular, coiling endlessly like a serpent devouring its own tail, looping the same tragedies and triumphs in altered disguises, reminding us that no civilization ever truly dies but is instead buried like embers beneath the ashes of forgetfulness, waiting for some distant wind of remembrance to fan them into fire again. And it was in that moment that I understood why the ancient scribes, those who carved into stone with trembling chisels, often left behind fragments instead of full chronicles. For they knew the truth was too vast, too dangerous, too intoxicating for any one generation to contain, and so they scattered their wisdom like shards across the continents, trusting that seekers in faraway epochs would piece them together under the guidance of stars. Yet the stars themselves were not impartial, for each constellation had once been a throne of gods, and the gods, though unseen now, still pulled invisible strings through the fabric of human fate, weaving disasters and salvations alike into patterns too subtle for mortal eyes. And I felt as though my own breath was no longer my own but borrowed from the lungs of those nameless figures who had walked deserts before pyramids were dreamt of, who had whispered into the hollow bones of caves before cathedrals or temples or mosques had ever raised their spires, and their breath carried into me a silence heavier than any sermon, telling me that time itself was a disguise. That the centuries we measure with clocks and calendars are only veils hiding an eternal now in which everything that was, is, and will be, exists already, side by side, like rivers running parallel beneath the skin of the world. And if one listens closely enough, if one surrenders enough, those rivers sing, and their songs are filled with names long erased from stone, with faces turned to dust before the first ink touched parchment, with battles fought not with swords but with memory, for memory itself is the oldest battlefield. And I realize that empires do not collapse when walls crumble but when memory fades, when children no longer recall the names that once guided their blood, when the stories of ancestors become no more than hollow myths to be recited in amusement rather than in reverence. And it was then that I saw, in the shadows of my thought, a procession of figures cloaked not in garments but in centuries, each carrying on their shoulders a fragment of truth, fragments so sharp that to carry them was to bleed, and yet they bore them willingly. Because to abandon truth entirely was to abandon existence itself, and behind them came another host, faceless and endless, whose chains rattled not from metal but from forgetfulness, their eyes blank, their mouths moving without voice. And I understood that they were those civilizations that had fallen not from conquest but from within, from forgetting the sacred thread that bound their beginning to their destiny. And in the endless churn of these visions I found myself standing upon a threshold that was not made of stone or wood but of silence, and beyond that silence was a library with no walls, no shelves, no books, only a living architecture of memory itself, rivers of thought branching like veins of fire through an eternal body. And I walked among those currents, each step sinking deeper into the marrow of forgotten ages, and I heard voices, some speaking in tongues that had not been spoken for 10,000 years, others whispering in languages not yet born. Yet I understood them all, for they spoke not in words but in essence, and their essence was grief and wonder entwined, a grief that mankind had always walked away from its own reflection, and a wonder that, despite this, something within always tried to return, like water to the ocean, like dust to the stars. And it was then I recalled the letter, that letter which none had read but which still altered the centuries. And I realized that the letter itself was only one leaf in an endless forest of unwritten words, each leaf trembling with the weight of meaning, waiting for the right hands to lift it into light. And suddenly I knew that I too was one of those hands, that every seeker, every wanderer who dared to walk beyond comfort into the abyss of questions, was one of those hands. And though the abyss was terrifying, filled with echoes that mocked and shadows that deceived, it was also the only womb from which truth could be born. And I felt myself falling deeper, past kings and prophets, past wars and ruins, past the bones of forgotten creatures who had ruled the earth before men had dreamt of fire, falling into a core where silence was not emptiness but fullness, where the heartbeat of creation itself pulsed like a drum, echoing through every cell of my being, until I could no longer tell if I was listening or being listened to, if I was the seeker or the sought. And in that confusion, in that collapse of identity, there opened before me a doorway made not of stone but of starlight, and the starlight folded inward like a scroll, revealing not words but visions, visions of cities built in spirals instead of streets, of towers that were not climbed but descended, of rituals where men and women touched their foreheads to the soil not out of subjugation but out of kinship, for they saw the earth not as ground beneath their feet but as the living skin of eternity. And in those visions I saw myself reflected, not as I am but as I was and will be. Countless selves gazing back through countless mirrors, and each self whispered the same truth, that history is not outside of us, it is inside, it is carved into the marrow of our bones, it speaks through the rhythm of our breath, it waits in the silence between heartbeats, and if we dare to listen long enough, if we dare to remember deeply enough, we too can awaken the forgotten ages, not as myth, not as story, but as living reality. For the line between past and future is thinner than a single word, thinner than a single breath, thinner than the silence that lingers now, even now, beneath the eternal gaze of stars.